At Sydney's school. With the excitement of being at Sydney's school, I soon forgot about my mother's failure to pick me up early enough. I thought it was a good idea to mingle with the rest of the kids, including Sydney's friends, who were usually picked up late. A while later, most of the kids were gone, and Sydney, in his young mind, perceived that something was not right. How come most of the late kids, for that's what they were commonly referred to, have all gone and I'm still here? Even so, why would Nandi be brought to my school? Thought Sydney. He continued playing with the few remaining kids, but with less enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the streetlights had been switched on as it had grown a little bit dark and no longer able to cover up his growing anxiety. Sydney withdrew from playing the games and, calling me aside, concluded it was too late for us to be picked up by our parents, leaving us with only one option: to make our own way back home. We both bade farewell to our friends and left the school premises. By this time it was already dark, and to Sydney this wasn't a very good sign. "Nandi, it is very late, that is why the street lights are on," said Sydney. "I wonder where Dad and Mum are." He then started to cry. I was a bit amused at my brother's cracking, especially since he was always the strong one. But my amusement didn't last for long, for when we started crossing the highways with heavy traffic. This called for me to hold on to Sydney's hand tightly and do some dashes across the roads. We walked down Colville Street past the General Post Office, following the exact route we'd always taken, thanks to our parents, on our way to school in absence of the family car. We walked along with many people, some of whom had probably been working late, and occasionally a few of them could not help wondering aloud how two young kids could be walking by themselves at that time of the night, a gesture which made Sydney quite uncomfortable, hence tightening the grip on his sister, me, who trudged along seemingly without a care in the world, for she knew that someone was there to mind her. At some point, a certain gentleman came walking up the street very fast. After going a few steps farther, he stopped in his tracks and retraced his footsteps to try and catch up with the little ones, my brother and me. He eventually did, before we crossed over to the other side, for we had by then reached Kampala Road. I guess he must have been concerned about the safety of the two lone children, which led him to ask us in a kindly voice where we were from and where we were headed. Sydney wasted no time in narrating our ordeal to the kindly stranger, and also mentioned that we were on our way home to Makindye. The time was just after 8:00 p.m, and most of the streets were deserted except for a few vendors here and there trying to wrap up their bags and stands. The stranger with a parental heart now took charge, and having told him where Sydney and I lived, he did not lose a minute in hiring a taxi for us. Looking back, I can imagine him praying for our safe journey home. Once in the warmth of the taxi, both Sydney and I set about giving directions to the driver to our home. As we were bright kids, the driver found no difficulty in delivering us safely into the driveway of our home. Having had his fare prepaid by the kindly stranger, he then sped off. Meanwhile, my dad and mum had been trying to contact people who were responsible for the late pickup kids, but the responses had so far not been encouraging enough. After several phone calls to relatives and friends, whom they thought might have possibly picked us up, they resorted to personal announcements over the radio, praying that someone would come up with the good news. It had been a day for my parents, first, my grandmother's stroke, and then the disappearance of their kids in dubious circumstances. It was one of the announcements on the radio which caught my dad's older brother, Lutta's, attention. Lutta was a no-nonsense man in his mid-50s with bloodshot eyes set deep in his face. He had a broad forehead and thin lips that never smiled. The only time his teeth, or what was left of them, were visible was when he was barking at someone. Almost every family member tried to keep out of his way, except his younger brother Larry, of whom he was very fond. Lutta, who at the time was visiting another relative of his in one of Kampala's suburbs, on hearing the announcement said hurried farewells and headed for Makindye. Those at home were already in gloom, but somehow managed to explain what they knew about our pattern of going and coming back from school. Having been given this information, he did not know what to do, as he was a country man who occasionally visited his folks in the city. So a heavy silence fell in the house as the string of phone calls of those wishing to be updated on the issue and of sympathizers had momentarily stopped. It was at this moment that the silence was broken by a car pulling up in the driveway. All those in the house rushed outside to see, except for Lutta, who remained seated in the chair, his face grim. My brother and I jumped out of the car into the waiting arms of our aunties and uncle, a bit relieved, but still our eyes kept on looking accusingly in the shadows, hoping to hit a target. Our dad and mum, who, in our young and immature minds, we believed must have forgotten to pick us up from school. On an impulse, Sydney asked where our mum was while I asked where our dad was as we headed towards the house. However, our anxious little faces were met with a glare from someone in the doorway who demanded to know why we had left school instead of waiting to be picked up by our parents, as was usually the case. Both Sydney and I knew our Uncle Ludder very well, so we had no satisfactory answer to appease his anger. Having thought we had done the right, in fact clever thing, which was to get ourselves safely home, the last thing we expected was being made to feel less than proud of our own rescue efforts. So both of us, once inside the house, dashed for cover, and despite the fact that I had all along been clinging on to Sydney, I dived under my parents' bed while Sydney went to our uncle's bedroom just to keep away from the visiting Uncle Ludder's angry outburst, for he kept on blaming us for our parents' predicament. My brother and I dozed off in our hiding places, from where we were later taken and put in our respective beds by our loving and relieved parents, for upon our safe return home, my mum's brother, who was staying in our home, notified my mum and dad by phone, thus enabling them to put off the search. They then headed home after informing a few relatives and friends they could get in touch with by phone at that time of the night, and arrived at some minutes past 1 a.m.